cheese. So I'm Janet Coates. I'm the Managing Director of the Consortium on Trust in Media and Technology at the College of Journalism and Communications here at UF. I have with me two fascinating panelists who are working on fascinating things. So to my immediate, let me make sure my directions are correct. So to my immediate right is Amelia Winger-Bearskin, who is the Associate Professor in AI and the Arts at UF's College of the Arts. And she joined us as one of the AI hires and is working on empowering people to leverage the bleeding edge technology to affect positive change in the world. So a nice small task to focus on. And I also have my colleague, Dr. Feng, who is the Advertising Associate Professor in Artificial Intelligence at the College of Journalism and Communications, and she works with me in the Consortium on Trust in Media and Technology. Her research focuses on the role of AI as an information delivery agent as well as a powerful research tool. So we're going to start by just kind of walking through our relative areas of emphasis in our work, and I'll kick us off, and then after we've talked a bit about what we're each doing, we can have opportunity for some discussion and some questions. So my area of focus is journalism. That's my background professionally before I was in higher ed. And I'm really fascinated by the conversations that are going on in the journalism world about generative AI right now. It is very much I think as is true in a lot of fields, it's very much a excitement about the possibilities and a fear and loathing feeling about what could go wrong, what could go sideways with generative AI. I've been on the road the last few weeks and have been in a number of rooms with journalists who've been talking about both sides of that coin. The interest in the connection between journalism and generative AI right now is largely driven by the fact that journalism organizations are sitting on large data. News organizations have their archives, have the content management systems that they use to produce their news and information every day. It's a lot of current natural language data that's related to a wide range of subjects that are of considerable interest in the public dialogue. So news organizations are trying to figure out news organizations have had their data go sideways before in the beginning stages of the internet, so I think people are trying to learn the lessons of that internet revolution and apply those to the generative AI space. You'll see that there are some news organizations that are leaning in and creating partnerships with generative AI. OpenAI and the Associated Press recently announced a partnership where the Associated Press is making their archives open to OpenAI as part of their training data, which has completely floored journalists. The AP has always been very careful and very proprietary about their archives because it's so rich. It goes back, the AP's been around since the 1840s, so between what they have digitized and what they have the capacity to digitize, it's a huge body of news stories, of journalism that kind of presents the evolution of humanity over the last 60, 70, 80 years. The idea that the AP would open their archives to OpenAI in a partnership, I was floored that happened. AP's been using machine learning for a lot of years, long before we were talking about generative AI, to do things like sports stories and box scores and stock market reports that took kind of the grungy things that took a lot of time, but they're they now have teams who are focused on the use of generative AI and are working with local news organizations to find use cases that would apply to local news. So not just the AP, they're looking at themselves as a training center for generative AI uses in local. In addition to that, OpenAI has been running around making deals with lots of news organizations, I think, trying to be first mover there. The American Journalism Project, which is focused on supporting new journalism initiatives, things that are largely nonprofit, also a few for-profit, but largely nonprofit startup organizations, has also entered a deal with OpenAI that's focused on developing AI tools, generative AI tools for those nonprofit newsrooms. So there's a lot going on in that space, creating partnerships. At the same time, the New York Times is trying to wall itself off and to basically build a moat around their data and not have it be part of the conversation with OpenAI. So there's very different approaches there, and we'll see how that evolves over time and where people feel like their interests are going to be served in terms of I think journalism organizations really realizing how valuable their data truly is. I'm going to just real quickly run through some of the use cases that I'm seeing in newsrooms right now, and then I'll hand off here. But there's a lot of, as I said, there's a lot of fear and loathing, and part of that is around the fact that journalism job loss has been so tremendous over the last 20 years. The number of newsrooms that have closed, the decline in the number of reporters. I think we've gone from, something like 50,000 to 15,000 in local news in that space of time. So there is fear about that, but I'm seeing people start to use it as a tool to help further and help extend the resources of local news. So some of the tasks that newsrooms are applying generative AI to right now are things like organizing their background material. So feeding in, here's all the background on a story, help me organize that in a particular way, whether that's chronological or by subject. Using it to brainstorm interview questions, which I've played with myself, and it's fantastic for that, being able to surface questions that I wouldn't have thought of. I've used it also to generate like ethics guides for particular stories. So if you have, for instance, there's a breaking news story that involves something involving a particular category of crime, I can put that in and say, give me some guidance, some tips about what my reporters should be looking at, what they should be careful of. And the guides that they generated have been fantastic. I mean, I was an editor for 25 years, and it's generating questions that I would not have thought to arm my reporters with in going into the field. So things like that, helping to learn complex subjects, doing basic copy editing, things like that are tools that are real value adds to newsrooms where their resources are truly stretched. So it'll be interesting to see what other use cases journalists come up with and whether they can kind of get past their fear to try some new things. So Amelia, you've got a mic, so you don't need to do the whole microphone thing.
I can share it. So thank you so much for inviting both of us to speak with you on this very important topic. I myself come from a fine arts background, and so I use AI in a fine arts context. Although I've been involved in speaking and discussing, either in newsrooms or on air or in conferences with a lot of members of the writers and actors strike, and talking to them about some of their concerns and helping to contextualize what are some of the technologies that they're talking about. A lot of them have an acute awareness of how this is already impacting their industry, and with eyes to the future on how it might impact their dignity and their craft, as well as their stability and income. And as an AI researcher, I can help them contextualize, okay, well, what is maybe happening behind that model? How is that working? Why is it so easy to deploy, or why is it not easy to deploy, and in what circumstances? When I was a Mozilla Fellow in 2020, we were thinking about what is trustworthiness in AI. That was the first question, like, before we can even decide if we should use AI in certain circumstances, do we know what it's going to do? Can we trust what it's going to do? And I think, we're never going to finish that sentence. We're always looking at how we can trust AI in new and different circumstances. But we have moved past that in many ways to actually starting to deploy these tools. As you mentioned, we're no longer wondering if we should. We are doing it. These tools are being used in our media landscape. We are using generative art. We are using large language models and foundation models to tell new stories. And yet we're also looking at the equity of what happens to the labor that was created to train those models. How are people going to create and co-create in the future? Will they still have the same type of dignity, the same type of job security, or not? That those people who created those words, that created those large language models, will they have that same experience? And of course, the new generation that we're teaching students, I encourage my students to play with these models, to interrogate them, to find out their limitations, so that they are prepared to use or not use, deploy or not deploy these in the jobs that they create, in the jobs that they will have, and in the stories that they will learn to tell. So it's a really exciting and interesting time, and that is, my area of expertise. I'm excited also to hear questions that the audience has at the end of our panel. So thank you so much. You have one too.
So now we have heard about something related to journalism and art, and now we're going to talk about advertising, the use of generative AI in the content creation in the context of advertising. So we know that when we create any advertising messages, we have to understand our consumers, right? So right now, a lot of marketers, they may use AI algorithms to understand their consumers. For example, they may use K-means clustering to classify or segment their consumers into different groups based on their underlying demographics, psychographics, and geographics. So with that information in mind, marketers, they actually can develop customized text prompt based on their understanding of each group. They can send those text prompts to tools like ChatGPT, for example, or some other generative AI tools like Midjourney, DALL-E, Stable Diffusion, you name it, right? So they can create basically customized advertising messages for each group. So that is one way. And another way is that they can actually invite each consumer to join this content creation process. So each consumer is no longer just a passive information receiver, but also active content creators. For example, Coca-Cola, they have this called Creative Magic campaign. So they invite each of their consumers. They can leverage the company properties like their package, like their logo, like their mascot, the polar bear. They can use those materials, and then they can prompt different AI tools, generative AI tools, to create their own personalized content. So we have these two different types of AI-powered synthetic advertising content, right? But there are some like trust issues and also communication effective issues there involved. But when we talk about trust, we have to think about trust is a bilateral relationship. So it's different from credibility. So when we think about trust, we have to think about source factors and receiver factors, as well as the context in which the communication happens. So for example, source factors related to those factors that advertisers, they can control. For example, like transparency, fairness, and also how real their content is if they're using AI. What I can see is that especially for the first time when advertisers, they consider each market group's underlying demographics and psychographics that create customized content. And once they put those content on different social media platforms, and those platforms, they require those marketers to disclose the advertising nature of those content. For example, Instagram, they probably plan to ask those content creators to use disclosure term like AI generated or AI powered, right, inside the message to kind of inform the consumers. So consumers will realize that, oh, this content is AI generated, even though it looks really real, but it's not human generated. So that will probably cause some trust issues there. But on the other hand, we want to think about the receiver factors, factors that marketer cannot control, but it's related to the consumers. For example, whether the consumers prefer personalization, whether they love this kind of customization experiences, whether they have any prior AI positive experiences. For example, think about the second case. When each individual, they can use those generative AI tools, and they can write their own prompt to prompt those tools to create some kind of content for a certain brand, right? Like Coca-Cola, they allow their customers to use their properties, like their logos, their packages, to create their personalized experiences. Consumers, they love those experiences because they love those personalization experiences. And also they feel like they no longer are passive information receivers, but they are creators. So they change their role. So because of that, also they voluntarily share their personal tastes with marketers. So they are not forced to share their private information with marketers. So in that case, trust issue will not be that big concern compared with the first scenario. Also, we need to think about the context in which all of this communication happens, like any relevant policies relating to the use of generative AI in advertisement. So all these factors can influence how we trust and perceive AI-generated synthetic advertising.
So I'm going to get the first shot at questions for these folks, and then we'll start taking some from the floor. But Amelia, I think the writer's strike and the actor's strike in Hollywood is really maybe the first opportunity where people have been forced to think about what the humanity of all this is, and what does it mean to the creative process, and what does it mean to have the work that you've done be what the machine learns on. So when you were talking about being in some of those rooms and trying to talk through that with those artists, what are they saying? What are the conversations that they're bringing to that?
Well, I think it's a very interesting group, and I think the reason why we are it is the first group is because they're very good at explaining things. They're storytellers. They're people we know because we have an empathetic response to the actors from TV shows. It's something that anyone can understand. And the stakes are somewhat clear to a generalized population when we might be talking about finer cybersecurity threats. There's a threshold where people might say, I don't know if that applies to me, right? But with the actor's strike, even though, and writer's strike, even though maybe you're not a writer, maybe you're not an actor, since they're such good storytellers, they're able to explain what is at stake. And what is at stake is this. You have writers' rooms that used to have, many people who are employed full-time creating something, and then in a year they might make a certain amount of money. Maybe it's residuals, maybe it's other ways, but very plainly it's you're making a certain amount of money. One of my friends said something like this. I wrote an episode of a TV show, a pilot, and from that I made $17,000 that year. Okay, that's a number that's very concrete. Right. She said the next year, because of different types of streaming rights, I did the exact same amount of work, exact same thing for a TV show, and that year I made $17. Right? And so that's 1 year later. So it's not 20 years later. It's not like back in my day. This person who told me this is very young too. She's much younger than I am. And she said, from 1 year, this is a difference. And we were saying, why? Why don't they need us anymore? Why isn't our work valued anymore? And it's because some groups were using and experimenting with AI generation and saying, maybe we don't need the work of these people anymore. But the problem is they weren't fully aware of the entire process, that it's not that you just write one thing one time, it's that you're sitting there, you talk with the actors, you talk with the director, it's constant meetings. We do a lot of meetings here, right? If you were to say, all you do is teach, that's all you do. Well, there's course development. Oh, I love this laugh in the back. Thank you for the laugh. So it's someone who doesn't understand an industry coming in and saying, I could do that in 10 seconds. Well, you can do something in 10 seconds. Mm-hmm. Also, what is inside that model? Isn't that all my writers from the last, 100 years? Aren't they inside of that? Were you given permission, right? Or did we allow you? We have found in some models that claim to not use copywritten material, they were, right? So we know that okay, there's a little bit there where maybe a different studio even is going to use the writer material of this studio to make something very similar, but without paying, right? So there's suddenly, oh no. It's not just the writers and not just the actors, but a lot of people are saying, oh no. This is something that is beginning to infringe upon our dignity, our self-respect, our crafting something and building something over time is not the same as maybe generating something when you had the first 8 seasons to train on. Sure, you can generate the 9th season, but that's because we were making it for those, what does that mean, right? How do we continue forward? And I think what I try to be as a facilitator is also talk about some of the positive uses they might find, right? This doesn't have to be a no never. It could be a yes and in the language of actors. We could say, okay, we are using this and people are getting paid in a new way. And contracts are mutually beneficial in a new way. I think the fear of AI very frequently is I see an unjust world, an unequal world, and I'm worried that we will have more injustice, more inequality, this time with data, right? And so that's what we don't want, right? We don't want just to accelerate inequity or accelerate or the decline of an industry, like you were mentioning with so many newsrooms, not having enough resources, saying, can we use this in a way that creates dignity, that respects a craft, and that respects the time that it takes and the importance of it, and yet also have new business models and business models that work for everyone. The type of people who are able to have the career as a journalist, if the amounts of money making it is so small, become only a small group of people, right? Only a small group of people don't need to make money. Right. So if we need diversity from all different standpoints, people that can truly have different opinions, then they need to be able to have honest work and they need to be able to be dignified in that process and to make wages that are fair. And so we see that, in newsrooms, and we will continue to see that in writers' rooms and in for actors as well, that if they're going to represent us, most people in America, we need to have jobs and we need to make enough money to feed our families. And so how we do that and make sure that we care for our communities, AI should be a helper. It should be something that comes in and aids and assists us, not something that continues to make things even more unequal and in ways that are often difficult for the general population to understand, right?
So building off of that, Yang, you were talking about the trust piece and the transparency piece, and when people feel like, oh, this is trustworthy, I know where this came from, and yes, I can trust it, and when people feel that resistance. So can you go a little bit more into your thinking? You and I have talked some about this. We just talked about this morning, about how do we determine what trust even is in an AI world?
Yeah. So first, since you mentioned about transparency, I would first start with transparency and then come back to the trust topic. So we know that there's definitely a positive correlation between transparency and trust, right? But because of that logic, and a lot of times policymakers say that, hey, we need to have disclosure because disclosure generally lead to transparency. Well, however, not every single disclosure can, lead to transparency, or every single disclosure can achieve the intended result. For example, we have different types of disclosure, like very simple AI disclosure, like AI-powered, AI-generated. That's very generic and very vague. Sometimes, people still don't understand how this synthetic advertisement is made by using what kind of data and what kind of algorithm. What's the mechanism behind, right? How does that affect my life? How does that affect my data? So we don't have any information. And we have detailed disclosure language. So I think simple disclosure versus detailed disclosure can have different impacts. And also, not every single disclosure can generally lead to transparency because disclosure can also have its negative impact. For example, when marketers, they use disclosure in their synthetic advertising, that can also lead to sense of falsity, right? So because consumers, they now can tell this is AI generated, this is not human generated, so this is fake. So that's kind of the the negative impact of using disclosure. That probably explains why a lot of marketers, they hesitate to include disclosure in their synthetic advertising. Right, so I think it's important to dig more into the role of different kinds of disclosure and their relationship between different kinds of disclosure and also transparency. And coming to the trust topic, like we mentioned, that trust is a bilateral relationship. So a lot of times we talk a lot about source factors that the content creators, they can control, but we also have to think about receivers, because receivers, like the audiences, they're very different. They're very different in terms of their demographics, psychographics, and geographics, and their languages, their cultural background, right? And some people, they are more receptive to new technologies, so they have used AI a lot, and they have prior positive AI experiences. So generally, they are more receptive to AI-powered content, and they like it, and they probably trust it more. But for others, they just don't have those kind of AI familiarity. And they probably are more kind of scared of AI generated content, so they probably have more negative attitudes toward AI. And also, like we talk about, there are two scenarios of using AI in advertising practices. One is like we create customized content for a certain group of people, and we just post the content on different social media platforms as sponsored posts, and people get them. But the other one is more powerful, is to invite each individual to share their personal taste and use their personal information to create their own personalized prompt, and prompt those generative AI to create personalized content. So for these people, probably they don't feel intrusive because they voluntarily share their personal information with marketers, and they enjoy this content creation process. We call this one like co-content creation process, because they work together with marketers and advertisers to create the content that they love and they feel proud of. Right? So because of that, I feel like they trust the marketers who invite them into this content creation journey, because they no longer are the passive information receivers.
Yeah, I think when we talk about transparency and bringing back to journalism and the issue of trust, and you and I have talked too about the receiver piece of all that, trust in journalism has been declining for forever. I mean, well, certainly since the 80s. And, I remember trust initiatives, that I was part of in the 90s, because we thought, oh my gosh, it can't get any worse. Boy, were we wrong. But part of the issue with journalism has been that journalism, we talk about transparency, but journalism remains very opaque to the receiver of it. I mean, you don't know. On television, you can see the questions asked, but you don't know where the information came from that informs the question. The use of anonymous sources, just not being able to kind of see the process, I think has created a lot of suspicion and, questioning of motives, and where did you really get this, and what's your, you're taking a stand here somewhere. And one of the things that's an interesting thought problem for me is that if journalism does use more generative AI, and we do say that part of doing that is that we need to be transparent about that, that means that being transparent is exposing some of the thought processes. I mean, if you're going to say as a journalist, we're going to disclose that we use generative AI for this, and our means of disclosure is that we're going to share the prompt. I mean, that's kind of revolutionary from a journalist perspective, because we haven't typically shared our prompts, the questions that we're asking, the thinking that's going into the framing of a story. And if we're talking about transparency in this world, it could kind of work backwards, right, to reveal the facts that we need to be more transparent as human beings, not just when we're talking about the machine.
Yes, true. And I think that when we adopt this reverse thinking, like when we're trying to disclose information to our audience, but we also have to think about whether they understand the jargons and the terms, right? So before we have this media literacy class, but now we need to have this AI literacy class. For example, like not everyone understands what is algorithm. What's the difference between machine learning and AI? For example, machine learning is definitely AI, but not every single AI application is machine learning. So what's the difference, right? So I feel like giving people this education means that we equip them with background knowledge. So then when we use any disclosure language, they do have the background knowledge they can leverage in order to evaluate your disclosure and also evaluate the quality of your content. So I think that's important.
When I had a lab for a brief amount of time on Wall Street, one of the projects that we got to do, and this was in 2016, so it was before a lot of the sort of public APIs where people could interact with large language models. We were using just GANs and unsupervised learning models, T-SNEs, like very early stuff. And we did a project with The Guardian where they opened their corpus to us to interview it. And they were like, can you interview The Guardian as if it's one corpus of knowledge? And something about that aspect of transparency is this. We had their 6 million, data points, articles. We had the tags that people had done, although with unsupervised learning, you're generating your own tags and associations and connections as well. We had questions that we used that were based on interviews, so they were trained on generating questions based on interviews, so it's kind of like learning from the interview questions that journalists in The Guardian had asked in interviews, right? So that's a good place to start. And then we have this algorithm. And then there are a billion points that there are yes and no's that happen. And that is what we've been talking a lot about today, which is that black box, right? So on a certain point, we know what the articles are, and on a certain point, we know the algorithm we created it. Because we weren't using ChatGPT, we were using our own bespoke, right? Because it's before the time, so we're using our own small language model, 6 million, not that big. But yet at a certain point, there is that black box where it's making decisions, and the transparency level, as you mentioned, could be more than it is now, because you're saying, okay, the prompt is more than not knowing the question at all. And yet there's just a billion data points that we don't know. And when we talk about the black box, we're not saying it's because people don't know because someone's keeping it secret. We're saying people don't know because people can't read those many billions of data points in their lifetime. Right? So that's why we don't know. That's what is happening a lot of times with machine learning, is so many decisions are made at such a speed that we as humans actually can't, go through that logic tree and say, okay, where did you say yes and no, and when did you decide this word and that, right? So it does also offer up some transparency, and then also obscures something in a way that humans, you could ask your journalist, just tell them who you're, maybe not your source, but maybe just tell them what question you asked, because controversy has come up, just please tell them. And unfortunately, that's something that right now isn't always possible, right, with these large language models.
Time. Do we have any questions anybody wants to bring in from the floor that we can further this conversation? Or do you want me to keep going? All right. There's one in the back.
Thanks. One of the things that I think is particularly interesting about this conversation is its relationship to copyrighted materials, because we're dealing explicitly with published works. Mm-hmm. And so I was wondering if you could speak to ways that copyright in its current form could either be changed, restructured, or maybe thrown out and replaced altogether, in terms of not only ensuring protections and dignity for the creators, but also, in this case, talking about creating transparency for consumers and readers, and people on the other side of the media.
Amelia, that sounds like yours.
Well, I'm very passionate about decentralization and technology, and I do see some of the kernels of, and we've been talking a lot today about the hopes and dreams of the early internet and decentralization, and something that seems possible with a technological solution is to be able to evolve copyright systems, copyright laws, copyright payments, allocations at a time when micropayments were impossible when the early internet happened, even though, as Eamon mentioned earlier in our panel, Tina, about Jaron Lanier and how he talked about a decentralized payment structure of an internet which would take attention as payment. And it was impossible then, mostly because credit card companies wouldn't let people pay for something on the internet with under $1. So if the dollar was the minimum and you were only looking at something for a millisecond, that didn't seem fair to have to pay $1 for every millisecond you're on the internet. But micropayments is a different thing now. And I think the hopes and dreams a lot of people, myself included, have about blockchain is that it could maybe offer a solution, although we have unfortunately not seen that happen yet. We've seen just higher rates of cost with lower rates of success, lower trust. But the D-Web and the decentralized web of technologies is still looking at how we can solve that problem. In Europe and in the UK, copyright is different around art, and of course that's my specialty is fine art, and so that's why I kind of use this as an example, but you have a kind of a default system around your IP and a default system around how somebody may sell or resell your art. And that gives it essentially a type of smart contract that's already built into their copyright law, something that we don't have in the US. So even if we wanted to do something very non-technological, like pass more laws and work with our policymakers, which we should do, right? We can do that. We can make our contracts more smart without putting them on the blockchain. We can be able to have things like every time something is resold, every time something is trained upon, there's this micro charge that goes down. It's similar to maybe the way we think about royalties, but those do exist in other creative markets, not in the US, and they have existed since the 80s. So this isn't, it's not a completely unsolved problem. Other people have solved it in new and different ways, and I think the United States will solve it in new and different ways. And this is a watershed moment with the writers and the actors strike to think about IP and say, wow, this is really valuable that I've been writing for 20 years. And I've sometimes, has anyone ever had this happen to you where on your canvas it'll say your writing has a high likelihood maybe of plagiarism, even though it's like your own writing? Has that happened to anyone? And I always tell people it happens to me, because sometimes it happens to a student, they get really worried. They're like, I didn't plagiarize this. And I say, well, you know what? It happens to me because I was one of the first female writers to have my work put into OpenAI. So I don't sound like it. It sounds like me. No, but you know what I mean. But it is trained on our writing, right? So it's part of us. We've added to the training of these systems. So I think it's important to know that, and writers maybe can start to think of the benefit that they are giving to culture and society isn't just one article, but the fact that that can be a blueprint to creative writing, to journalism for many generations to come. And so maybe we're just needing to situate importance in a different location. And sometimes funding and money is something that we all need to work out as a community, as a culture. And when it comes to transparency and disclosure, we can decide, do we want to support things that are not, fairly paying their writers, or are not, maybe it's okay if it's using AI, generative AI, but it's doing so in an ethical way. And I hope that we get to a point that happens. Like, I hope that you can opt in and say, I do love this TV show that uses AI, and I know that it's done in an ethical way, and this is why. I would love that day.
I also want to add something there is, for me, like any machine learning algorithms, they're powerful because they have training data that we use to train them, so they can be smart and intelligent. So for example, like, I don't know how many of you use Midjourney here. Anybody have heard about Midjourney? Which is a very powerful, right, generative AI tool that allows you to text prompt it and you can get your images and paintings. So I read an article recently that Midjourney, they actually did not pay those independent artists when they use their paintings as training data. So I feel like it's really important, like we have those regulations in place to require those companies to disclose what kind of training data they have used to train their models. Because without that information, we don't know, right? And also recently, I encountered a very interesting marketing case from Heinz, the ketchup brand. They actually mentioned in their commercial that if you use DALL-E, which is another generative AI drawing tool, you text prompt, quote unquote, ketchup, and you're gonna see Heinz image show up. Well, think about this. Brands, they can do this manipulation. So what they can do is they can offer their property, their copyright, with those generative AI tools. And they can send them large number of data to train their model to bias them. So, for example, right, Heinz can send tons of images to Midjourney, to DALL-E. So next, once a consumer text prompt ketchup, and Heinz brand will show up. And there's association linked together, so brands can actually make use of that training process and to bias their models and to fulfill their marketing goals there.
Anything else from the
Other questions?
field?
Great,
There's one
thank
back
you.
there.
Hi. That was very fascinating just now.
So that's kind of a strange thing where they can intentionally give data to bias the model. Then is there any sort of maybe ethical consideration where other people should have some responsibility to unbias the model? Like, do we want them to do that so that from now on when we use those tools, we only associate ketchup with Heinz, or do we have a responsibility to de-bias it?
Yeah.
That was my question.
Oh, thank you. That's a great question. I feel like, yes, we definitely can de-bias the model, but the thing is that we need to know their training data. For example, what examples they have given to their model, right? For example, in terms of ketchup, what kind of images they have sent to the machine for the machine to learn. So basically today, I just talked to my students, I gave them an example. No matter how smart your student is, if you give them trash materials, they will not learn well. So for any machine learning algorithm, it's not how smart the algorithm is. They're just mathematical formulas. It's what kind of training data you give them. And the training data, if the training data contains bias, the machine will generate biased results. And we also have the saying garbage in, garbage out. If you give them trash data, they will give you trash outcome, right? So to basically de-bias them, we have to look from the start of the point, the source, the training data, what kind of training data they use. So I think, like I said, that the regulators, they should probably play a role, require those companies to disclose their training examples they use to classify each category, to define each category. So with that information, I think, like especially social scientists, we can enter into the field and evaluate their training data and see how fair they are and how biased they are, and then we can do something to correct the bias there.
Thanks. You got me thinking with that garbage in, garbage out. But at the same time, Janet, you mentioned something earlier about journalism and that the story about AP, looking to work with OpenAI to feed in what anybody would consider not garbage from journalism. That's the highest quality stuff. And I think across all three of your fields, advertising, creative, or art, or journalism, I just wonder, do you try to sort of boycott it and say we're going to hold all the quality stuff back and we need to protect that? Or do you think the lesson is that we need to feed all our real high quality stuff that people used to make careers and get paid for and go along with it? Sort of parallels a conversation earlier this morning about AI and assessment and education, which is, are we going to fight it or are we going to actually engage it? So I kind of want to pose that question to this panel.
Well, I will say, and people at CJC, Amy's heard me say this, I was there for the revolution when the internet became a thing, and newspapers did this, journalists did this. We don't want to be part of this. It's a fad. It's going to go away. Our craft is our craft, and we will continue to walk down the road to our craft. There's been conversation in journalism that the original sin of the journalists and the internet was that we didn't, start getting paid for our content from the get-go. And I would say the original sin is that we didn't engage, that we let others make decisions and set up the path for what would journalism on the internet would look like, and we didn't participate in the conversation in any kind of constructive, productive way. I would like to not have that experience again. It didn't turn out real great for journalism. So I think that, I think there are people who are nervous about what the AP's doing. I would lean more towards the AP than the New York Times. I mean, I understand the New York Times economic model is let's wall it all off as much as we can, but somewhere between those two is where the conversation needs to start. And if we don't engage with it, we will be right back where we were with the origins of the internet, the rise of social media, where we will be watching the train roll by and wondering why we weren't on it, why we weren't part of that conversation when we self-selected out of it. Yeah. So
I also think about like the garbage in, garbage out. I feel like one day my students ask me, now we have all these generative AI tools, why should I just take those courses? And I said that because those courses give you domain knowledge for you to write better prompt. So I think it's important to understand that without certain domain knowledge, without theories, without those concepts, constructs, you will not be able to write really relevant prompt to prompt those tools and give them really good source of information to work. So yes, I think even with the rise of AI, we still need traditional education.
We have time for one more question. All right, let's thank our panelists, please. That was fantastic.